On the morning of my 35th birthday, I believed, against every lesson my childhood had taught me, that something simple might finally happen. My mother had called the week before and said, "Just family this year. Nothing big." Those 4 words felt like a peace offering. In our family, nothing big usually meant a carefully staged performance, but I let myself hope. Hope had always been my worst habit. I drove across the city just before dusk, through streets dusted with early autumn light. My parents' townhouse sat on a narrow hill, tall and dignified, like it had opinions about who deserved to enter. Several cars lined the block, too many for a small dinner, but I told myself not to overthink it. When I stepped inside, the quiet hit first. No music, no voices, no clatter of plates or smell of cooking, just silence. The hallway lights were on, every one of them bright and unwelcoming. As I moved toward the living room, I realized the furniture had been removed, replaced with rows of folding chairs, all of them filled. People I hadn't seen in years stared at me as if I'd walked into court late. Cousins, distant relatives, old neighbors, business partners I only recognized from holiday photos. Nearly everyone my parents had ever cared about impressing, and all of them were waiting for me. My sister appeared at my elbow with her practiced smile, slipping her arm through mine before I could retreat. "Perfect timing," she whispered. "Just stand here." "Stand for what?" I asked. She didn't answer. At the front of the room stood a long table, papers stacked neatly across it. My father rose slowly, microphone in hand, pausing until the room fell completely still. That was when I understood. This wasn't a birthday dinner. This was a presentation. "For years," my father began, voice calm and rehearsed, "our family has carried a burden quietly. Tonight we're going to set the record straight." I felt my stomach drop. He lifted a thick folder. "This," he said, "is a full accounting of what it cost us to raise our daughter." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I tried to laugh. "This isn't funny," I said, but my voice barely carried. He flipped to the last page. $420,000. The number hung in the air like smoke. Then he slid 2 documents toward me. "You may repay us," he said, "or you may sign away your claim to your grandmother's house." I hadn't even known there was a claim. Before I could speak, my sister gently reached into my bag and removed my car keys. "I'll hold on to these," she said sweetly. "I need them more than you right now." No one objected. That was the moment something inside me went very quiet. I set my purse on the floor, looked at the faces watching me weigh my worth, and walked out without a word. I didn't yet know that 4 days later, they would all be begging me to come back. And I definitely didn't know why. But what none of them realized that night, what would soon change everything, was that my grandmother had left behind more than a house. And they had just triggered the part of her plan designed specifically for this moment. The night air outside the townhouse felt sharper than it should have, like the city itself had decided to be honest with me. I stood on the front steps for a moment, half expecting someone to follow, to call my name, to pretend this had all been a misunderstanding. No one did. The door stayed closed behind me, sealing in nearly 200 witnesses to the strangest trial of my life. I walked until my heels started to ache, then kept walking anyway. My phone buzzed in my hand before I reached the next corner. "Ethan, I'm nearby. Want a ride?" Ethan had been my closest friend since college, the only person who had ever seen my family up close and never tried to explain them away. I typed yes without thinking. He arrived in minutes, engine idling like he'd been waiting for a signal. I slid into the passenger seat and stared out the window as we pulled away. "They really did that, didn't they?" he said quietly. "They charged me," I replied, "for being born." He shook his head. "That wasn't a family conversation, that was an execution." At my apartment, he insisted on staying. I paced the living room while he made tea, replaying everything on a loop, my father's voice, my mother's silence, my sister's smile as she took my keys. "I should have known," I muttered. "Known what?" Ethan asked. "That it was never a birthday." Sleep didn't come. When morning did, my phone was vibrating itself off the nightstand. Missed calls, texts, voicemails stacking faster than I could delete them. By afternoon, I turned the phone face down and stepped outside to collect my mail, desperate for air. Most of it was junk, except one envelope, cream-colored, thick paper, my name typed neatly in the corner. Rowan and Keller, attorneys at law. My chest tightened. I sat on the steps and opened it carefully as if it might explode. Dear Miss Hart, we request your presence regarding the estate of Alina Hart, my grandmother. The date at the bottom told me it had been delivered nearly 2 weeks earlier. Ethan came outside and froze when he saw my face. What is it? A lawyer, I whispered. About my grandmother's estate, he frowned. Didn't your sister ask you something about that last week? The memory hit instantly. Have you heard from any lawyers? About grandma's things? I'd thought it was idle curiosity. My stomach sank. They knew, I said softly. Or at least suspected. That evening, I finally answered my phone. My father didn't waste time. We need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding. You humiliated me in front of strangers, I said. That wasn't confusion. That was strategy. A pause. Then, carefully, have you received any mail recently? There it was. I'm done, I replied and turned my phone off. That night, I opened the small wooden box my grandmother had given me before she died. At the bottom was an unopened envelope in her handwriting. For the first time since my birthday, I felt something steady replace the shock. Tomorrow, I would meet the lawyer. And tomorrow, I would finally learn what my family was so afraid of. Because whatever my grandmother had left behind, it was powerful enough that my parents were willing to destroy me publicly just to get it. The law office sat on the 3rd floor of a narrow brick building just outside downtown, the kind of place you'd walk past 100 times without noticing. No marble floors, no dramatic glass walls, just a brass plaque and a quiet hallway that smelled faintly of paper and old coffee. Ethan waited in the car. I'll be fine, I said, though I wasn't sure who I was convincing. Inside, a receptionist asked me to take a seat. My knee bounced against the carpet as I stared at a framed photo of sailboats on the wall, wondering how a birthday dinner had turned into a legal mystery. Miss Hart, the lawyer who greeted me, was older than I expected, with silver hair and a calm voice that suggested he'd seen families unravel many times before. My name is Daniel Rowan, he said, gesturing toward his office. Your grandmother spoke of you often. That alone nearly undid me. He opened a thick folder and slid a document across the desk. This is your grandmother's will. I recognized her signature instantly, the slanted handwriting, firm and deliberate. She left her house to you, he said gently, in full. The words didn't land at first. To me, I asked. To you alone, my breath caught. What about my mother, my aunt? She was very clear, he replied. You were her choice. Then he turned the page. There's an additional clause you should know about. Something in his tone made my shoulders tense. If any family member attempts to coerce, publicly shame, or pressure you into giving up your inheritance, they immediately forfeit any claim to her remaining assets. The room went very still. Images flooded back, the microphone, the bill, the witnesses, my sister taking my keys. They already did it, I whispered. He nodded once. Yes, they did. My hands trembled as he handed me another envelope. She asked that you read this after our meeting. I opened it carefully. My dear child, if you are reading this, then they have tried to make you believe love is something you owe. It is not. I left you the house because you stayed when no one else did, because you showed up without asking what it would cost. This is my way of standing beside you when I no longer can. Tears blurred the ink. They knew there was a will, I said after a moment. Didn't they? They were informed one existed, Rowan replied. Not what it said, they assumed. Of course they had. When I walked back outside, the city felt sharper somehow, as if someone had adjusted the focus of the world. Ethan looked up eagerly. Well, she left me the house, I said. Just me. He let out a slow breath. That explains everything. By the time I got home, my phone was vibrating again, apologies, demands, confusion, fear. I didn't answer. That evening, I found another note in my grandmother's wooden box. One line, underlined twice. You are not responsible for who people become when you stop protecting them. I sat there for a long time, understanding something new. This wasn't an accident. This was a plan. And tomorrow, when my family finally learned what that clause meant, their panic would turn into something far more desperate. I didn't answer my phone for 3 days, not because I was hiding, but because I was listening. Silence has a strange sound once you stop filling it with explanations. It hums, it settles. And in that quiet, I replayed every detail of my birthday night with new clarity. My father's confidence, my mother's folded hands, my sister's casual theft. They hadn't hesitated. That mattered more than anything. On the fourth morning, I turned my phone back on. The screen lit up like a warning flare. Dozens of missed calls. Voicemails stacked in rows. Texts that shifted in tone as I scrolled, from offended to confused to suddenly polite. The first voicemail was my father, clipped and controlled. "There's been a misunderstanding. Call me back." By the fifth, his voice was tight. "This is becoming a problem." By the 10th, it softened. "We can fix this." Fix. As if humiliation and theft were clerical errors. That afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I checked the peephole. All three of them. My parents stood shoulder to shoulder, dressed carefully, faces arranged into something that resembled concern. No microphones this time, no audience, no witnesses. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. "We need to talk," my mother said immediately. "So talk," I replied. My father cleared his throat. "We spoke to Mr. Rowan." I raised an eyebrow. "Already?" "There are complications," he said carefully. "No," I corrected. "There are consequences." My sister crossed her arms. "You're overreacting." I looked at her. "You stole my car." She flinched. "Dad said." "Dad doesn't get to say," I cut in. My mother's voice trembled. "Natalie, please, you have to understand how this looks." I almost laughed. "How it looked when you charged me $400,000 for existing?" Silence fell. My father tried again. "That house should stay in the family." "It did," I said. "With me?" "You're tearing us apart," my sister snapped. "No," I replied quietly. "I stopped holding you together." That's when my father's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, hesitated, then answered. "Yes." The voice on the other end was loud enough for all of us to hear. "Richard, what did you do?" a woman demanded. "I just spoke to your lawyer." My father's face drained of color. "She told me everything," the voice continued. "The clause, the witnesses, 200 people. You tried to bully your own daughter publicly." My mother grabbed his arm. "What is she saying?" "Clients are calling," the woman went on. "Partners are nervous. People are talking." The call ended. The hallway felt suddenly smaller. I spoke softly. "You should leave." My mother looked at me like she didn't recognize me anymore. "You're really doing this." "I already did," I said. My father's voice cracked. "I'm sorry." I studied his face. "Sorry for what you did, or sorry it didn't work?" He didn't answer. That was all I needed. I closed the door. And for the first time, I realized something important. They were no longer in control. But the next thing I learned would prove this wasn't just about a house. It was about everything they'd taken from me without permission. The next morning, I went back to the law office. Not because I was afraid, because I was ready. Daniel Rowan greeted me with a knowing look, as if he'd expected I wouldn't wait long. He motioned me into his office and placed another folder on the desk. "There's one more detail you should be aware of," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "There's more?" He slid a single page toward me. "The car your sister took," he said calmly. "Your father never had legal authority to transfer that title." I stared at the document, then laughed, softly at first, then with real relief. "So it's still mine?" "It always was," he confirmed. For the first time since my birthday, I smiled without forcing it. 2 days later, a police officer accompanied me to my parents' townhouse. Not for revenge, for retrieval. Ethan drove with me in silence, the city blurring past the windshield. When we pulled up, the building looked smaller than I remembered, less imposing, less permanent. The officer knocked. My sister opened the door. She looked different. No polished smile, no confident posture, just tired. Without a word, she handed me my keys. "They said it wasn't legal," she muttered. "It wasn't," I replied. For a moment, something flickered across her face, resentment, shame, maybe both. Then she closed the door. I slid into my car and rested my hands on the steering wheel. This wasn't about transportation. It was proof. Proof that I hadn't imagined the line they crossed. Proof that I wasn't powerless just because they wanted me to be. That evening, I packed. Not angrily, not dramatically. Carefully. Each item I placed in a box felt like a decision: what to keep, what to release, what no longer belonged to the life I was building. By midnight, the apartment looked hollow. So did I, but not in a painful way. In a finished way. The move to Salem happened on a quiet Sunday morning. My grandmother's house stood at the edge of town, modest and weathered, white siding softened by years of wind and salt. The moment I unlocked the door, the scent of lavender and old wood wrapped around me like a memory that recognized me. This place knew me. Aunt Clara met us there with groceries and a warm smile. She would have liked this, she said softly. You coming home? I think so, I replied. For the first week, I did very little. Unpacked slowly. Cleaned carefully. Learned the rhythms of the house, the creaking floorboard near the stairs, the window that caught the afternoon sun, the spot in the kitchen where my grandmother used to lean while waiting for the kettle to boil. No one demanded explanations. No one kept score. Peace arrived quietly. But far away, in the world I'd left behind, things were beginning to unravel, and I was about to hear exactly how badly. Because the whispers spreading through my family's world were no longer about money, they were about reputation, and reputations don't recover once the truth starts traveling. The first hint came from a phone call I hadn't expected. It was Aunt Clara, her voice careful in the way people sound when they're choosing which truths to reveal. Your father's name came up at the club today, she said. Not kindly. I closed the screen door and stepped onto the porch, the afternoon light warm on my face. What happened? People are asking questions, she replied. About your birthday, about the house, about why nearly 200 people were invited to something that wasn't a celebration. I pictured that living room again, the rows of chairs, the microphone, the witnesses. They wanted an audience, I said. Yes, Clara agreed softly. They just didn't expect the audience to remember. Within days, the whispers turned into patterns. A business partner postponed a major deal. Another quietly withdrew from a project that had been scheduled for months. Nothing dramatic, no accusations, just hesitation. And hesitation was dangerous in my father's world. Reputations like his were built on certainty, on the idea that he was composed, ethical, controlled. Now people were wondering. My mother's world shifted too. According to Clara, lunch invitations slowed. Committees she dominated for years were suddenly restructured. Friends who once called daily became unavailable. No one confronted them directly. They didn't need to. Silence was doing the work for me. One afternoon, while I was sorting through a box of my grandmother's old recipe cards, Ethan called. You okay? He asked. I am, I said, surprised by how true it felt. He hesitated. Your sister called me. That made me pause. Why? She wanted to know how you were, he said. She sounded lost. I closed my eyes. That evening, as the sky deepened into purple, there was a knock at my door. 3 slow taps, not urgent, not hesitant, measured. I looked through the glass and felt something old stir in my chest. My parents stood on the porch. No sister this time. They were dressed carefully, as if appearances still mattered, but their posture was different. Less certain. Less tall. I didn't open the door right away. I watched them the way you watch a storm from inside, aware of its power, but no longer afraid of being caught in it. Finally, I opened it halfway. We need to talk, my father said. So talk, I replied, keeping my hand on the door. My mother stepped forward. This has gone far enough. I almost smiled. Compared to what? My father glanced past me into the house. The lamplight, the quiet, the place that now belonged to me. That property should remain in the family, he said carefully. It is, I answered. With me? My mother's voice shook. We never meant for things to go this way. But you let them, I said. Silence stretched between us. Then my father said something that surprised me. Your sister is struggling. I felt the familiar tug, the old reflex to step in, to fix, to carry weight that wasn't mine. I let it pass. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, but I can't solve it. My mother whispered, if you walk away now, there may not be a way back. I met her eyes calmly. There was a way back. You closed it in front of witnesses. I stepped back. I wish you well, I said, but I'm done. They stood there for a long moment, waiting for me to change my mind. I did. After my parents drove away, the house felt unusually still. Not empty. Settled. I stood in the entryway listening to the soft ticking of my grandmother's old clock, the one she'd insisted never be replaced because new clocks rush too much. For the first time, I understood what she meant. Time didn't feel like it was chasing me anymore. That night, I slept without dreams. No rehearsed arguments, no replayed scenes, no tightening in my chest, just rest. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the kitchen table where Grandma and I used to drink tea. I brewed coffee and opened my laptop, finally tackling the things I'd postponed for years: utilities, insurance, repairs, paperwork. Then I did something else. I planned my future, without asking where my family would fit. The thought scared me more than anything else had, and then it thrilled me. At work, the change was subtle but undeniable. I spoke more directly. I hesitated less. I stopped volunteering to absorb other people's chaos. One afternoon, my supervisor lingered after a meeting. "There may be a senior position opening later this year," she said casually. "Would you be interested?" A few months ago, I would have deflected. "I would," I said simply. She smiled. "Good, I was hoping you'd say that." When I got home that evening, a small package sat on the porch, no return address. Inside was a teacup. Grandma's old one, the cracked rim she'd refused to throw away because broken things still hold warmth. Tucked inside, it was a note in Aunt Clara's handwriting. "I thought you should have this." I held the cup carefully, smiling despite the ache in my chest. Some connections didn't need explanation. A few days later, my sister called. I stared at her name on the screen longer than I needed to. "Hello," I said. "They're not coming back," she told me quietly. "They finally understand you're serious." "That's probably for the best," I replied. She hesitated. "I don't know how to be in this family without you fixing things." "That was never my job," I said gently. We ended the call without drama. That weekend, I cleaned out the last unopened box from Grandma's room. At the bottom, beneath scarves and faded photographs, I found an envelope labeled house. Inside was a handwritten list, maintenance notes, names of trusted neighbors, reminders to oil the back door hinge every spring. At the bottom, one final line: "This place will take care of you if you let it." That evening, I sat on the porch with the cracked teacup warming my hands and watched the sky darken. For years, I'd believed closure came from conversations, apologies, reconciliations. I'd been wrong. Closure came from choosing not to reopen doors that had only ever led to the same room. As the stars appeared, I realized something quietly astonishing. I wasn't angry anymore. I was free. But the final test of that freedom came sooner than I expected, when a message from my father arrived that forced me to answer one last question about who I truly was without them. The message arrived late at night. One sentence: "I don't recognize you anymore." I stared at it for a long time, not because it hurt, because, for the first time, I understood exactly why he felt that way. He had never known me. He had known the version of me that apologized first. That softened every conflict. That turned herself into something manageable. That version was gone. I typed a single reply: "You never really did," and I let the silence take it from there. The weeks that followed were quiet in the best possible way. Autumn settled fully into Salem, painting the trees in copper and gold. Mornings became slow walks before work. Evenings became tea on the porch, wrapped in blankets, listening to leaves scrape softly across the street. At the hospital, my life shifted forward. The senior role I'd been offered became official. More responsibility, more leadership, more visibility, and something else: respect. Not the kind that came from obligation. The kind that came from choice. Ethan noticed it first. "You stand differently now," he said once, half joking. He was right. I wasn't bracing anymore. One evening, I opened Grandma's final journal again. Most of it was reflections, small stories, recipes she never finished writing down. But one entry near the end stopped me. "Some people will only love you when you agree to be small. Let them miss you at your full size." I closed the book and laughed softly. Winter arrived early that year. On the first snow of December, I sat by the window with the cracked teacup, warming my hands, and watched the flakes drift down, each one falling quietly without asking permission. I realized then that I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for approval, not for reconciliation, not for permission. The world had widened. My parents' lives continued somewhere beyond my walls. According to Clara, my father's firm never recovered its certainty. My mother withdrew from most of her circles. My sister eventually moved away, chasing a life no one had designed for her. I didn't follow any of it closely. It wasn't my story anymore. One evening, as the year drew to a close, I stood in the kitchen and noticed the old clock ticking steadily on the wall. No rush, no demand, just time moving forward, carrying me with it. I whispered a quiet thank you, not to fate, not to luck, to myself, for leaving, for staying gone, for choosing a life that didn't require permission. Because what mattered most in the end wasn't what I walked away from, it was what stayed. And this calm, honest, self-chosen life was finally mine.